Allora, good afternoon. I'm Senior Research Fellow at Foundation for European Progressive Studies. I'd like to welcome our guests, both here in person and those attending online. For those who don't know FEPS, we are a member of the European Socialist Party and the group of democratic socialists within the European Parliament. 3 years ago, together with FES, close to German Social Democrats and the European Policy Center, Alberto is here representing the European Policy Center, launched this research that has been going on for approximately 3 years about disinformation and migration. And we are gathered here to share with you to illustrate the results of this research. We published 2 papers. You can download them from our websites. A third paper is about to be published. I think, yes, we are almost ready. Why disinformation and why migration? Well, disinformation, what's at stake is democracy in our country. And disinformation, fake news, have an impact on public discourse and political discourse. Decisions taken based on fake news or out of context can impact political decisions. And why migration? Because this information can apply to different topics, but migration this information is impacting migration, as Alberto will tell you, because this information tends to incite concerns, worries among citizens. Migration often encompasses the fear of diversity. We have many speakers, so very briefly, welcome once again. And I'd like to thank our partners. FES, Tobias Schmitt is online with us and will take the floor after me. The European Policy Center, Alberto is here with us. And our partners here in Rome, Federation Institute of Rome, CESPI, who organized this event. I'd like to thank Daniele Fraggeri, President Piero Fassino, Barbara and Valentina for their precious contribution, and other partners who supported us, Foundation Nenni and Foundation Socialismo. And I'd like to thank Arthur, my colleague, and of course, all participants for attending this meeting. Tobias, you have the floor. Tobias will speak in English. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Well, before starting, I'd like to show you a video. It's a synthesis of the research, and then I'll give the floor to Alberto. Before giving the floor to Alberto, who will explain to us what has been done, well, first of all, let me introduce our guests. Tana Anglana, expert in migration development and changing the narrative about migration. The president of Association Carta di Roma, Marco Mazzoni, from University of Perugia. Giancarlo Penza, responsible for humanitarian corridors from Ethiopia, Community University of Sant'Egidio. Alberto, you have the floor. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers. I had the chance to leave Brussels with a very bad weather and come to a sunny and warm Rome. Thank you, Tobias and Eddie, for our collaboration that started a few years ago. And it has been an excellent collaboration. I'd like to underline some important aspects linked to our research that can help frame it. Well, first of all, this research has been lasting for some years, so it'll be difficult to give you many details. But as Eddie has just said, you can download these publications on our websites. A third publication will be published next week. And then allow me a disclaimer. The research is focused on disinformation at European level. We know that fake news are adapted to languages rather than national context. So I will have a European perspective, but during the debate, we can have a focus on the Italian context as well. So in the next 10 minutes, first of all, I'd like to underline 5 main aspects that are very important, in my opinion. Then I will briefly discuss the countermeasures that we took into consideration that were implemented following Russian invasion and following a disinformation activity at a global level. Without giving you too many details, I'll give you some further information about pre-bunking. I will try to explain to you what are the reasons why we think this could help solve problems that we have to tackle when we want to counter disinformation. Finally, I'll speak about a disinformation case concerning migrants from Ukraine, but I will also add some aspects concerning other groups of migrants and refugees. So the first element I'd like to underline is that disinformation on migration is spread very rapidly in a systematic way. That's the case, for instance, concerning refugees from Ukraine. A few days after the Russian invasion on the 24th of February, fake news started to spread on televisions, newspapers, local media, social media. Some of these news concerning violent actions for which refugees were accused, wrong statistics on percentages of Ukrainian refugees looking for protection, some fake news concerning students leaving schools or students who had to leave their schools to give room to Ukrainian refugees. This fake news circulated in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, as well as in Italy and Spain, for instance. A second element is that disinformation can easily adapt to the political cycle. The war in Ukraine is just one of the latest examples. According to our studies, There are other examples, among which Afghanistan last year, when Taliban took the power, or the tensions between Belarus and the European Union a few months earlier. Disinformation agents exploit political issues, great political issues, to give more visibility to their hostile news. They try to polarize our societies, as Eddie was saying. They try to undermine our value systems in our democratic states. A third element is the following. Disinformation is not just promoted by foreign agents, foreign states. It is also promoted by European actors. But foreign agents usually attract our attention. Sputnik and Russia Today have been banned at European level a few years after the war broke out. As I was saying, researchers, fact checkers have always underlined that disinformation is used on sites or by European users. And as we know, in Italy, disinformation about migrants and refugees is used also by political stakeholders. And then a fourth element, disinformation describes migrants as a threat to our health, to our security, to our identity, to our wealth. All fake news circulating online have these three frames: health, wealth, and identity. So this information about health, for instance, illustrates migrants as a possible threat for new infections, new diseases. Narratives linked to wealth would define migrants as a cause of unemployment. And identity frames concern illustrate the arrival of asylum seekers and migrants as an invasion, representing a threat for the future of our societies. So these narratives can be found online in all languages, in all European states. However, as I was saying, this information can easily adapt to the news cycle, to national context. So there are differences from one European member state to another. This information can be adapted also to the various groups of migrants. This information concerning Ukrainian refugees is very interesting because it has some peculiar characteristics. Ukrainian refugees are not usually described as a threat for European identity. This does not mean that there are some fake news or conspirational theories using identity. But according to researchers, this kind of disinformation focused on identity, as far as Ukrainians are concerned, is not very much used. There are just some extremist group who use this kind of narrative. Most fake news concerning refugees concern both wealth and security, the two other frames I was talking about. So many fake stories circulating online today in Italy, as well as in other European countries, concern accommodation, access to education, healthcare, financial resources. And these stories often present claims according to which Europeans are discriminated. The fifth element is that disinformation linked to migration tries to appeal to values and concerns of our citizens. If disinformation or narratives are consistent with these concerns, with these convictions, then there's a risk. These narratives could leave the echo chambers, can circulate at a general level within our societies. They could lead to different attitudes vis-a-vis refugees, vis-a-vis policies. So a number of studies I refer to in the publication, in our next publication, have underlined that messages focus on fears concerning wealth, safety, and security are all often linked to negative attitudes vis-a-vis migrants and refugees, and they are often combined with restrictions, with restrictive policies. And the present context, well, European citizens are worried for energy costs, for our security. So at present, fake news can exploit these concerns and could have also a political impact. Very briefly, I'd like to say something on the countermeasures we have envisaged and we implemented
at European level. So briefly, European institutions have taken two measures focused on debunking, or what we call fact-checking. That is to say, trying to highlight false claims online, and are also focused on monitoring disinformation agents or sources outside the European Union. As you have understood, I think that this type of response is not sufficient. As to monitoring, as I said before, disinformation agents are not exclusively China, Russia, or Kremlin control groups or external government agents. In fact, this is a problem that affects also European societies, and as such, these monitoring systems that are run by European institutions are not sufficient because they give us just a partial picture of the whole scenario. Independent fact checkers, like journalists, and we have many in Italy, and there are many organizations with headquarters in Rome, do not have the same political and legal obligations, and therefore can disclose information independently of the sources. And as the video clip showed very clearly, this type of fact-checking can occur only once a disinformation or false claims have already been placed online and have reached the public. And sometimes not only platforms are not willing to remove those contents. And this is something we can discuss. So in a nutshell, we made several recommendations recommending a change and from debanking to pre-banking. Without being too technical, because this might be a risk, what I can say about this paradigm shift is that basically pre-banking is centered on greater preparation and foresight for information narratives that we will see in the future, and a greater resilience, social resilience at European level or in the member states, so individually. So preparation is based on the ability to take preemptive actions in terms of narratives. And in the current context, I think there are concerns that I think that disinformation is exploiting security in economic and financial problems, and therefore we should launch awareness building campaigns. And second, I would like to emphasize the importance of media literacy. Media and information literacy, in fact, is the second branch, as we say, or second arm of this pre-banking policy. And at European level, there is a lot of fragmentation. In Eastern Europe and in Central Europe or in Southern Europe, very often people do not have the means to distinguish and separate truth from fake news, and therefore find the information autonomously. I think that this is a great concern. Now, I would like to draw my conclusion. I realize that all these changes that, of course, are more detailed in the paper that is going to be published are not easy to be carried out, because we are not speaking only of policies, but it's a mind shift, a cultural change that is deeply needed, is badly needed. But we said already that this change is urgent, is a great emergency, and I invite you all to read our publication to get more details about our proposals. Thank you, Alberto, for this introduction. And now I would like to go to the next speaker. Tana Anglana, expert of migration and development. How does narration change? Sorry, and what happens? Narration, fake news, foresight and preemption campaigns. Can you tell us something about it? Well, there were a lot of food for thought, and I will forget something, but I would like to say something on what Alberto raised. But please allow me to make a digression. First of all, we have to wonder why people accept or give in to disinformation, and we should not only cure the symptom, but treat the disorder. So people move and look at the information through certain mental approaches. So that is to say, complex topics as migration are not seen from scratch with a clear mind. There are some biases also as to vaccines, etc. In fact, we approach the stories with our point of view. We decide our vision, our approach, and we look at information sources, and we are surrounded by people that share our opinion. We socialize our opinion, and we select information. And at that point, it's not very important whether they're true or not. What is important is that they confirm our point of view, is what in social psychology is called confirmation bias. So more than trying and understand later on how to treat this and solve the problem, it will be more interesting to understand why this happens, how people approach news, what is the weight of the mental approach, the mental scheme in doing this? This is very difficult because we know that this is part and parcel of our identity in individual, and therefore it is very simple. And sometimes just a word or an image starts a connection. Sometimes if you look at Google and you Google migration, the first thing that comes out is something bad. But I would like to underline something else. It's not always very healthy to point out divisive narratives or those who use this for electoral purposes. Sometimes we had a very harmful mindset or frame of mind. I came from Ethiopia when I was a young girl, and I had to deconstruct the narrative of development cooperation that was based on fundraising and showing victims and victimizing pictures. So this is the first thing. Second is that we should understand who do we talk to and how do we speak. I was talking to a friend of mine and saying that often in conferences, even if I work in cooperation, development cooperation, it's self-referential. We talk to each other, we support each other. We should get out of this communication bubble. And a research that was mentioned by you in your publication, a paper published by Morin Common and Ipsos in Europe and in Italy on behavior and perception of Italians and other Europeans against migration. The picture that is shown is very different from the usual polarization. We used to see exchange of information and those who support our opinion and those who are against our opinion. This is a polarization. Actually, there is a large part of people in Italy, 40% of the people do not take a clear stance, a clear position, but can be influenced by mass media. We call them fluid center. Perhaps you saw it international or movable middle. These people don't speak because usually we speak about counter narration and we try to give information and communicate with statistical data and speak about the ignorance of people about migration. But this creates a barrier because we are patronizing, we are teaching, and sometimes we feel superior in educating people about migration, and therefore we keep them aloof at distance. So I really appreciate what Andrea was saying about having a different value-based approach, trying to connect with people, talking to their emotional intelligence. I don't want to speak of speaking so with compassion with people, but trying. You remember Joe Coxell, the British Parliament member of Parliament who was killed, and during the last speech at Parliament level, she said, "We have more in common." And we can be surprised looking at these mental pattern of health, safety, or well-being. These are positive values that we can share, but with different interpretations. Speaking of security with migration or in front of migration, speaks not only of building walls, but welcoming people and the different values. the values of us who work in development cooperation, and those who are scared and do not understand what is behind statistical data. People in their daily life don't know anything about statistics, and everything can be interpreted. Do I have a time for an example? Look at how much was discussed about people who die in Central Mediterranean Sea, and how much a political narrative says that once political actions were taken, fewer people die at sea. And this is true if we see the statistics about people who die in the Mediterranean Sea. But if we look at the rate of mortality, things change completely. Actually, Central Mediterranean is unsafe, unsecure, and deadly. So a skeptical public that is not interested, how much does it take to make the difference between mortality rate and number of deaths? Nobody would listen to us, and therefore we have not only deconstruct narratives and focus on counter narration with facts, bombarding people with numbers, but we have to do something else. That is to say, emotional connection on the positive values that define us as citizens of a community. This could be an interesting step forward because, as George Lakoff, a very important sociologist, said, the example of political discourse. If I tell you, don't think of an elephant, what are you thinking now? Most probably you're thinking about an elephant. So saying that migration is not a problem, migrants are not criminals, is just triggering this mental pattern that are typically rooted in our mindsets. Of course, there are certain techniques, and I translated some international center of policy advocacy, media and instruments, some instruments developed by this center to have a more effective communication pattern. So I invite you to read about this in Google www.narrative/IT. And it's a very interesting paper on this pattern. I would like to stop here. Thank you, Paola.
Thank you. Valerio. You're president of the Association Carta di Roma. What Tana was saying is very interesting. I mean, juxtaposition is not a winning strategy, but what can we do? And I know you wanted to show us something. Well, that's a good question. I'm president of this association, Carta di Roma, whose task is to help our colleague to try to find an appropriate language based on an ethic code. The Roman Charter has set some principles, very simple principles, to use the legally fair terminology, to avoid putting migrants in danger. I mean, these are basic rules, but I've been working, well, I've been working in this sector for 5 years, and every single day I have to start all over again. I mean, there are moments when I think that we made some progress, we managed to help our colleagues to change their discourse, their language, but then some politicians arrive and we have to start all over again. How to talk about migration? Today, a new word has been used, residual load. Our Ministry of Interiors has used residual load to define those who are not allowed to disembark. When I started to deal with migration, it was during the 80s, towards the end of the 80s. We would call every migrant Moroccan. Those who arrived in Italy independently from their country of origin were called Moroccans. And one day there was a car crash in Italy, and a local newspaper used this title: car crash, semicolon, a man died, a Moroccan died. I mean, can you imagine there was a distinction between a man and a Moroccan? That was the starting point of using a dehumanizing language to separate between us and them. So there's this link between politics and journalism that has been constant over time. I totally agree. Well, even when, for instance, even liberals in Italy, when contesting Salvini, they used a specific language that was not helpful to change narrative, that would rather help Salvini. I mean, basically they were supporting his approach because the use of the term irregular makes no sense for those coming by sea. They are identified as irregulars, but maybe they aren't. Boats are visible at sea because there are people on boats screaming and asking for help. So using the term irregular for these people just asking for help has a negative impact on the narrative. I remember that there was a period when we started not to use that term in, it was July 2013. The Pope went to Lampedusa and he used different words. He hugged these people, thus showing a different attitude towards these people. And then there are different kinds of migrants, different kinds of refugees. On the Ministry of Interior's website, there's a section about migration, and there are some data about arrival, and they call it console. We don't know why. And so we have daily data on arrivals. And it's like a game. I mean, this data is used to increase our fears. It's always the same old story. Usually at the beginning of the summer, someone launches the alert saying that 1 million people are ready to leave Libya to come to Italy for an invasion, maybe. And then they started to count these people. So you will see a journalist on a deck. Here we are, 1,000 people have arrived. The day after, 2,000 people have arrived. And this causes some anxiety in our societies. Every time you look at, you listen to the news, you hear new numbers. That's the mechanism used. And then always on the website of the Ministry of Interior, there's a section, a specific section for Ukrainian refugees. The first words you see is "Welcome to Italy." This means we have a different approach. And of course, probably we welcome Ukrainians because they're more similar to us. They're white, most of them are blonde with blue eyes, whereas other migrants coming are not white people. What I'm saying is that politics can change the rules and journalists go after politicians. And politicians use some words and not other words. So the words used to tell about migration can influence our attitude towards migration. And our mission as journalists, our mission is to look for the truth, to check facts. We should also remember that our main task is to look for the truth. We are not here to make political propaganda. We are here to give information. I'd like to show you a video, and within our association, we tried to, well, we took some titles, we replaced some words of the same titles just to show the difference. Words can have different effects depending on how they're used. So the use of word is very important. Sociologist Austin says that words make things. Words can make a revolution if they're used in a certain way. We try to make a small revolution with our work. We try to help journalists use the right language. We offer training courses to journalists. We try to change our approach. I have a reference book Roman Queneau wrote, Style Exercise, a very small episode on a bus, but it is told in 99 different ways with many different viewpoints. That's what we should do. Look at migration from all points of view available. This will change our perspective. We did it on the 25th of April 2020. Will you show it after? Well, I'd like to go back to the video you have just shown us about the use of words. I'd like to ask Marco Mazzoni, communication professor, I'd like to ask you, well, irregulars, resources, economic migrants, residual load. Valerio was mentioning, we are talking about a dozen people on a boat. I'd like to ask you something about the role we can play. What can we do to help a paradigm shift? Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here with you. I'm sorry, but I don't like virtual meetings, but I'm in Perugia. I had a lesson and I couldn't make it to Rome. So I don't like virtual meetings, but well, I couldn't do otherwise today. I'd like to start from a contradiction. Researchers say that we are in a digital native society. My teenager daughter is extremely skilled compared to me. And yet, most people, as Tana was saying, believe in fake news. Why do they believe fake news? That's the real question we should ask. Because we should educate people to use digital tools, but well, most people know how to use digital tools by now. Our period is characterized by a general distrust. We don't trust political institutions. We don't trust media. If you look at Reuters' report, it's an association from Oxford University. They carry out an analysis about the information system in different Western countries, among which is Italy. Out of 100 Italian respondents, 35%, well, only 35% trust information they receive from mainstream media. This means that 65% do not believe what our journalists say. So these 65 people would look for different sources of information. They trust more than mainstream media. Another worrying piece of data is that very few, only 12 Italians out of 100 subscribe, well, pay to receive information, to receive news. News have a cost. Let's take a classical news portal, Corriere della Sera, a traditional Italian newspaper. Of course, I'm asked to subscribe. If I want to read their articles, I have to subscribe. And I prefer to subscribe to Corriere della Sera. Those who do not accept to pay will look for different sources of information, and this can feed disinformation. Another important element is that, well, we don't trust institutions, and we are experiencing a polarization. Polarization is something that has always characterized Italy. Let's think of the First Republic. There was a strong polarization between white, red, and black. But this polarization is not based on values or perceptions. It's a sentimental polarization. It's an emotional polarization, but rather negative. We're looking for rage. We're looking for a fight. What we want to say is that the other are bad. And this kind of polarization has an impact on the media, because what I call an attention market is being created. How can I attract people? I create disorder to attract their attention. So when dealing with such an important topic as migration, there's a lot of hostility and disorder, information disorder. These are elements that characterized our debate, our discourse. Back in 2016, I carried out a study on the narrative of one of the worst dramas. It was the 3rd of October, 2013. Over 300 casualties, 300 victims, a huge tragedy. How this event was told? Well, it was told through a humanitarian frame. What I mean by that? Well, according to, journalists underlined emotional aspects, pain, the narrative of someone leaving his country, telling about his trip. But, well, these aspects are emotionally strong, but even this kind of storytelling could have a negative impact, telling about migrants who leave their countries and go on a difficult trip, putting their lives at risk. Well, this is a storytelling that is very interesting for readers, but this storytelling oversimplifies the event, a big issue. Sometimes we underline some details, that emotional details, but we forget to make a reflection on the reasons why these people are leaving their countries. What are the real causes for migration? Why do these people leave their countries to get to Europe? So it's true that very often the main frame is that of a threat. Migrants can increase can increase crime rate, can increase disease, and so on and so forth. But sometimes even focusing on emotions and feelings means to oversimplify what's happening. The issue is a complex one. Well, I'll stop here and maybe I'll say something later. Thank you.
At this point, I would like to give the floor to Giancarlo Penza, who is in charge for the humanitarian corridor from Ethiopia for the community of Sant'Egidio. We spoke about language, and I would like to go back to the video with which we have introduced this meeting was referring to wrong perception of numbers in Europe. And I was struck by the fact that during the so-called perceived invasion in 2015, 2016, or better said, during the humanitarian crisis of those years, according to UNHCR, perceived invasion was 36% of Italians. So it's a big number, considered that we had 20 million foreigners in Italy. So I was asking myself, why do they have such a misled information? And I think that the first problem we have with information is that today we are a mature country in terms of migration, but we continue to see it as an emergency and not a structured or structural problem. And therefore, we cannot go on, we cannot develop any further. And this is a big problem, because if we would really give a sort of historical information how migration evolved in our country, we will discover that in 2 decades, from 1990 up to the crisis in the year 2008, we increased the number of immigrants 14 times. It was a 14-fold increase. That is to say, what in France, Germany, UK happened in 60 years, in Italy it happened in 20 years. Was it a social alarm? Well, we had problems because migration is a phenomenon that comes with problem because it's a complex phenomenon. But the social alarm in those 2 decades was never so high or so relevant as it happened later on. How come? It is those years that Roberto Maroni, Minister of the Lega, regularized 650,000 irregular migrants. How can we explain this? Well, the problem is that people came to Italy with a temporary permit, and then when it was no longer valid, they stayed over in trying to reconstruct their life because they found a job. It was sure that they found a job, and even if they were irregular, there was an amnesty to make them regular. So we never had closed ports. We had open airports. So the perception of a migrant that flies a regular flight is not the same as those that arrive by boat. And then everything changed because in 2011 we have the Arab Spring. We know about it, so I'm not going to speak about it, but stringent measures were taken. And therefore, migration is perceived as traffickers, human trafficking. And this is an alarming notion. But also in the years of between 2011 and 2017, we had 7,500 thousand people coming, but we had more than 2 million of foreign citizens who registered in Italy. So even in the period of crisis, the narrative, the storytelling of migration was a distorted narrative. The Carta di Roma between 2015 and 2021, in its report, and here I would like to show you a slide, in its reports told us that migration is strictly connected, and I think Valerio said, with the intensity of public debate on migration. So it's not linked to the real phenomena, but to the political discussion and how much politicians focused on this topic. Some years ago, the European Observatory on Security made a poll, and I would like to show you this slide that I like very much. The observatory asked Italians whether migrants are a danger for Italians and the security of people. Look at the percentage of those who said yes goes up in when electoral campaigns were carried out. And the lowest, so the trough, that is to say 26%, is when the Monti government established a minister for migration. Is there any connection? I belong to the Sant'Egidio community, so is there a connection? Is there a link between information and policy making and distorted facts, and how we can counteract this? Next slide. I will run through the slides very quickly because of time. Those are news or information. You see there is a peak in the period of the refugee crisis. So the Arab Springs, 2012, 2014, Syrian wars, and the peak remains high. Next slide. And we have the peak and the people in favor of Ius Soli decrease substantially. And this is a demonstration of how disinformation can really affect perception of phenomenon, and therefore also the structured approach. The Carta di Roma that I mention so often tells us that the title of TV news and mainstream newspapers are basically focused on migration flows and give very little information on social, cultural, economic aspects related to migration. And this is a problem because in a country that, as I said, is to be considered a migration mature country, because we have people coming from abroad that now have become Italians. And therefore, it's a problem to focus only on emergency and not investigating the phenomena that should concern us most, that is to say, school, economy, and all those aspects that are so important for the future of Italy. And migration could really help us and give us, be a trigger. For instance, school in Italy. The school system has really made gigantic steps forward in integrating foreign kids. But there are still some problems. But let's speak about these problems and not about migration flows, etc. It is true, the conflict in Ukraine gave us a different view of refugees. Somebody said it so well before me, but I think that this is also due to how information was given about the war. First of all, why we had this narrative. When we speak of refugees, and I've been in charge of humanitarian corridors from Ethiopia, and I have refugees, Eritrean refugees that live in Ethiopia, come to Italy. I challenge you to tell me, I challenge the average Italian to tell me something about Ethiopia or Eritrea, but they're not very far from a cultural viewpoint from us. And I can give you further example. Like it or not, we are globalized. Even if so many things are said about globalization, etc. But we are a globalized world. And when we consider the world as globalized, all the wars are close to us. Empathy towards Ukrainians is connected to how they were narrated, how the narrative went. And therefore, the images that really called for empathy. It is true that there is greater emotional empathy with them because they are European, but it's not only this. The point is that the problem was raised in a positive way, and there was a positive narrative about the story. So I think that this is just one example among many others that shows that how we speak about things, how we tell stories affects how people look at the story. And I would like to conclude by saying that in our experience with humanitarian corridors, civil society often and surprisingly, at least for us, is more advanced than the guts feeling that sometimes people have. Because when the story, the single case is presented, and when we speak of immigrants that come through humanitarian corridors, and if the story is told fairly, correctly, the Italian society is very open to integration and to welcome these people. With the humanitarian corridors, we have 450,000 people that came to Italy and were hosted by civil society, which means parishes, religious families that welcomed these people and hosted them in their homes with great generosity. Why? Because there is a story. The storytelling is not filtered through by triggering these sentiments of invasion, scare, fear, and we use appropriate language, telling things in a positive way, and this makes a big difference.
Well, there's a lot of food for thought, but if you were saying how difficult it is to eliminate online contents, and then there are differences between global news and local and national news. But please be short because we're running out of time. Well, yes, to eliminate fake news. Well, removing fake news at national level, there's a lack of coordination. The law the video was referring to tries to harmonize the different Italian national initiatives. Right now, it is important to focus on the impact of this new law because it will allow for a great flexibility to platforms. As to illegal contents, platforms will be obliged, it will be mandatory to eliminate them. As to these latest contents we are talking about, I mean, they are not illegal. Platforms will be free to remove them or to keep them, so that we will assist at what we will experience a great fragmentation among the different platforms. As to local information sources, there's a lack of trust vis-a-vis our media. This lack of trust is limited to local sources. So readers trust local media more than national media. And this shows, well, so there are some channels, some communication channels the public trusts more than others. And this is important to know. I would like to add something to what has been said so far. Perception is important. Numbers are important. Different statistics have been told. I'd like to add something. Between 2020 and 2021, there were approximately 200,000 irregular arrivals compared to 3 million people regular arrivals. So these statistics do not correspond to the public perception about migration. And I agree we should use a different language to avoid polarization. What is striking is that just a word is enough to change public perception. And I think it is urgent to think about, well, to change this language today. We talked about Arab Springs in 2016. Well, in that case, or the answer was one of solidarity, also because the media language was basically positive. The storytelling was positive. Let's think of Syria. Storytelling about Syria was very positive, but then this has rapidly changed. And along with this change, also public perception changed. I think that right now, the situation is very similar. The High Commissioner for Refugees of the United Nations in their last report said that 100 million people are refugees. They are granted international protection. So we are facing a number of challenges, not only in Italy, but at a European level. So what are the policies that will be implemented? This will also depend on the storytelling, on the narrative used by media. Thank you. Well, first of all, if you have questions, please write them in our chat. And we have already received 2 questions, and I'd like to ask you these 2 questions, starting from Tana. Ugo Poli says, well, up to now, no one has taken into consideration a utilitarian perception in terms of productivity, demographic growth. That's a very interesting aspect. Well, allow me an introduction, a serious one. So yes, of course, it's important to talk about the positive contribution migrants can offer to our societies. It's important how we do it. I'd like to thank Professor Mazzoni. He underlined that very often when telling about positive stories, we use the typical storytelling of the hero that could have a strong backlash. So I think when telling positive stories, well, even the utilitarian word is not the good one, the right one, in my opinion. And at personal level, I was born abroad, but I've always lived in Italy. I don't want to be considered in terms of productivity. I don't want to be considered as workforce. I'd like to be seen as a person. So what I try to do, rather than telling about utilitarian stories, I'd like to normalize migrant lives. I would rather talk of normalization to be inclusive in our society. We don't need desperate cases or heroes. We could very well have normal people contributing like everyone else to our social life. Otherwise, we could become either experts of our problems or, well, when talking about migrants, they're just normal people. We should include them as we would include any normal person coming to live with us. So we should normalize the lives of these people. Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to Piero Fassino, who has just joined us, president of CESPI. Thank you. It's a very interesting research. Well, let me first give you some data. Migration causes some fears, that's for sure. When we see in your country, in your town, in your building, you see new people coming. They eat differently, they pray differently, they have different habits, they speak a different language. What's our human natural reaction? We feel some fear. We are scared. So in front of diversity, we are scared, okay? This has a consequence. If migration causes some fear, a good policy would be that of eliminating fear from migration. And this is not the case. The biggest problem for democracy is the link between, is the intertwining between politics and media. But well, let's stick to our point today. The management of the political and media management does not aim at eliminating fear from migration, rather underlying it. I mean, when talking about migration, the first image we gave is that of boats full of people. That's the point. How can we elaborate policies that will free migration from fear? We need policies. And if this is the case, something that does not help such strategy to free migration from fear is that of acting in an emergency situation. We look at migration as an emergency on a regular basis. We have always looked at migration as an emergency, thus increasing fears. So we should convey a language, a message that will recognize migration as a structural phenomenon. Many citizens have understood it. When you consider that most of our caregivers are foreigner, well, you will understand that if we don't have foreign women, we won't have caregivers. We all know that. Just go to a working site. Most workers are foreigner from Kosovo, Romania. So, I mean, the phenomenon is very well visible, is widely recognized, and yet the representation of migration gives anxiety. If we want to take out fears from migration, you should avoid anxiety. And we have a daily representation that gives us anxiety. And this is true not just for migration. This is a problem concerning information. Media are always looking for details. 2 people have just committed suicide thanks to, well, after the news given by TVs and social media. So can you imagine how difficult the situation is, how risky the situation is? The real problem we are facing is that when we have citizens, as you have just said, who think that migrants represent 20% of the population, whereas they represent only 7%, that's the devastating effect of disinformation, whose aim is to provoke anxiety and fears. Media information should also educate the public. Maybe not all journalists agree on that, but they should. And then there's another aspect we should take into consideration. Migrant distribution is not homogeneous. In Italy, as you know, migrants represent 7-8% of our population. I live in northern Italy, and on average in our towns, we have approximately 20-25% of migrants. All northern towns in Italy have 20% of their population who are migrant. In Turin, where I live, many students have foreign parents. So we should also look at distribution. That's an important aspect if you think of integration policies, perception. That's an important issue. Demography is fundamental from a quantitative viewpoint as well as from a qualitative viewpoint. Welfare state in Norway or Sweden works because there are just 10 million people. And I think we should focus on this aspect because, well, integration paths are more successful where there is a higher percentage of migrant population. We often think that the more the migrants are, the more difficult it is for social cohesion, but that's not the case. In those societies where migrants have higher percentages, well, this phenomenon is more widely accepted. This is another aspect we should take into consideration. One last element I'd like to underline is migration policies. In Italy, we have two models. A model according to which the Ministry of Interior is responsible for migration policies, and a different model according to which mayors are responsible for migration policies. And the second model, it's more inclusive. When a boat arrives at Pozzallo and the Ministry of Interior is supposed to distribute migrants, they start to call all prefectures, and even the best prefectures are worried only about finding an accommodation for these people. Once they found an accommodation for these people, that's it. They have accomplished their task. When mayors are responsible for migration policies, they go beyond accommodation. They deal with school, they try to protect young girls, they offer services to migrants. That's a fundamental aspect for migration policies, because if policy migrations are rooted at local level, local authorities can help social cohesion, social inclusion, thus mitigating fears. On the other hand, migration policies rooted at ministerial level will increase fears and anxiety. Thank you, President Fassino.
So I give the floor back to Valerio because we had a video, but I also would like to ask you a question raised by Teresa Albano. What are the responsibility of publisher and journalists? I understand that journalists need information, but what is the editorial line? There is no doubt we have two main tasks: educating and reporting to our boards the infringements. The infringements of the codes are analyzed by the disciplinary commissions that take the appropriate measures. In the Lombardy region, the committee is made up of colleagues of the main newspapers. And of course, the response is not appropriate. And sometimes those who infringe the code are not appropriately punished. We made a proposal and we repeat it every year because there is a big difference. There are journalists who work for policy, politics, sorry, so they make propaganda. And there are other journalists who do not do it intentionally, but because sometimes they use the wrong words, they make a mistake. They are not making any propaganda. So we are working with them. With them, we can have a frank discussion. The other are the scarer, those who scare people out of their guts. And we have newspapers who always infringe the code, and therefore we want the director of the journalist to be ruled out of the journalist order. But this is the answer to your question. I hope I answered it completely. I wanted to say something else. So we said that for Ukraine, there is a different approach because it was discussed in a different way. So the storytelling was different. We have seen the story, we have narrated it, and we see it every day, day in, day out. But that a war is not involving us directly. We are not the main protagonists. In Eritrea, the situation is completely different because we have a historical responsibility, and the young boys who are brought back to that country are imprisoned in prisons built by Italians, and they're tortured by the dictator who receives hundreds of thousands of euros to train these people who run away, and the torture they undergo have Italian names. United Nations have condemned this regime for crimes against humanity, and one of those who was shipwrecked told us about the tortures. He described them in details, and they're so horrible, not even to imagine. So this is something we have to consider. The war in Ukraine is not touching us directly. It's not close to us. Last but not least is the fact that, of course, they speak a different language, they eat and they drink different things, but the people would not protest, would not make raids if they don't know things. So there is something we have to understand. And with the video we showed you and with the new video, which is different, we try to go back to normal. We did it during the pandemic on April the 25th, singing the Bella Ciao song. And we would like to show you this video clip. I don't remember the name, but the last one, however, sorry, I forgot the name of the video clip. Is somebody listening to me? So it's the last video clip we gave you. Yes, we're sending it. Congratulations. I go now to Mazzoni because I wanted to ask Professor Mazzoni, do you think that this scares due to these emergency narrative, or is it something that is touching us deeply, as Member of Parliament Fassino said? So very quickly, because we are late. So what Member of Parliament Fassino said is very right. But we have to consider also the type of media, because this is a problem with our research. When we cover a topic, we focus on national media, mass media. Now, immigration is a transnational, global, relevant topic. And I think that the narrative and the perception of the narrative is very much linked to local newspapers and how they tell the story. Local newspapers that we find, for instance, in Umbria, in the Umbria region, but I think you can find it also in all regions. You can find the mainstream newspapers, and the narrative is based on facts. So the facts, the daily facts, are linked to micro criminals, and often these are irregular people coming, for instance, from Morocco, as somebody said, the Moroccan guy. And why does this happen? We have to really clarify something. Journalists do not want to really give this information, but very often it is much easier to speak about irregular migrants instead of giving names. And therefore, we easily label them referring to the group of they belong to, or the ethnic group, or the national group, etc. If instead an Italian does something, you call him by name, him or her. If it's an immigrant or a foreigner, usually you refer to the origin, so the country of origin, especially in irregular migrants. So it's oversimplification. I think that one of the main problems when we speak of immigration, and this is very true in local newspapers, is oversimplification. Oversimplifying means giving a narrative that is distorted because it has an initial bias. And this is something that has to be analyzed. So what is the role of a local press? It is very important, as important as the national press, or if not more. Thank you, Professor Mazzoni. But I think that the problem is that when you ask someone, is this a problem? Usually people say, yes, it is, because they hope that things would be further improved. What do you think about it? I will be really very quick. So utilitarianism and what Valerio said about Ukraine. Sometimes ago, a journalist, a special envoy journalist that I really keep in high esteem, even Domenico Quirico, you might know him, even if sometimes he's a little bit too extremist. And when a TV channel was differentiating on economic migrants and illegal migrants, which must be made, of course, he said, but do you think that a boy from the Ivory Coast that comes to Italy to find a job and for 2.5 years is tortured in Libyan cancer is a social or an economic migrant? Has he become something else? So utilitarianism. And if Europe were really faithful to its principles, a main principle, founding principle, so human rights, etc., should really welcome with open arms these immigrants. So, Valerio, it's true what you say, differentiating Ukraine from Eritrea. But don't forget that the Ukrainian community in Italy before the war was the fourth most representative group, mainly represented by women, which is rare in Italy. So most of which are family caregiver, and this had a great impact on families. I know that there are senior citizens who are really desperate because of the war in Ukraine, and they welcomed in their homes, small homes, the family members of their caregiver. So it is true, but we should not neglect this important aspect. Well, you're right, this is a problem. Immigration is a problem. And Fassino was very clear about it. It's a big problem of our time, and it's a big resource as well. The problem is that we have to accept that this phenomenon be considered a structural phenomenon of an advanced economy. And now I leave aside the demographic aspect, but we should open a whole chapter about it. We could discuss it for hours. But also just from an economic viewpoint, and Piero Fassino said it very clearly, the problem is that as we are a mature country, we must tell the story in a different way. And please, please, we have to differentiate the information alarm from the political alarm. We should try our best as journalists and really dissociate from political messages when when they are not necessary, because even when the pandemic obliged journalists to deal with something else, it's not that immigration disappeared. It instead increased. So storytelling is important. It should be decoupled from the political message that usually it's not always, but often instrumentalized. So I thank all of you. I think we can go to the adjacent room where we will be offered a buffet. And I would like to thank also those that are in streaming with us. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the evening.